So you're in a cult. You watched all of my videos and still, somehow, you joined a cult. Now they're passing around the Kool-Aid and you just realized you may have made a mistake. What do you do? What do you do? Well, don't drink the Kool-Aid. I had the pleasure of speaking with author and theologian Ted Nottingham. He got in touch with me following my Fellowship of Friends Rate My Cult. I'm going to link that down below for anyone who may have missed it. Short summary of the Fellowship of Friends cult school. They're in Northern California and they're headed by a man called Robert Earl Burton. They follow the teachings of a man called Gurdjieff, who himself was a controversial group leader, but his works have proven to be useful and relevant 100 years later. Now, Ted Nottingham joined the Fellowship of Friends, but left after a few years because it didn't feel right to him. Now, since then, he's done incredible work in religion and theology and has completely eclipsed Robert Earl Burton. This is his story, and I guarantee you that you will learn something from it, something that will help you. Maybe not now, but at some point in the future, because most of us will find ourselves in a toxic group or situation at some point in our lives. So here is Ted Nottingham's story. I am also linking that video that he did on the Fellowship of Friends, because he has his own from his perspective. Oh, hi, Ted.
Hello.
So yeah, I finished your book. The Path to Inner Transformation, Path of Inner Transformation. I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I obviously don't know exactly how old you are, but it seems you were young. You were young in the 70s and you got caught up with Robert Earl Burton.
Well, let's take it from the beginning, shall we?
Yes, please.
Um, I would say that the critical piece is that I came across Gurdjieff and The Fourth Way and Uspensky and Maurice Nicole, and as I told friends at the time, it was a volcano in my life, and I knew I would never be the same. And I went after that knowledge as oxygen for life. It was completely revolutionary. And as I went looking for book after book, I came across a bookmark. And the bookmark said there are centers of teaching centers where you can learn such things. And I couldn't stop. I was just overwhelmed that not only from these books written in the 40s and 50s, now there was actual living teaching going on. And right there where I was at the time in Florida, there was a teaching house. And so I spent a year with these people who had come from California, from the center, and shared with them and their own knowledge and seeking and just absorbed it like living waters. All I knew was that there was someone called a teacher in the background who was a conscious being, was the idea. Someone who had achieved through the practice of self-observation, non-identifying, inner separation, not being the thoughts, being the higher consciousness, the third state, had achieved it. And so I went into it with utter, total naivete. I was 23 when I
Wow.
moved out to California, left everything, family, the woman I loved, all of it, my vocation. I had just written a book and had found my talent exploding, thanks in part to these teachings that were giving me a whole new perspective on existence. Left it all for the sake of knowledge. So that's the key to keep in mind. For many of us, we were entirely focused on the authenticity of this transformative material, which was unlike anything else around. It wasn't philosophy or good ideas, it was inner change in oneself.
Ah, one note here that I thought was really interesting is that yes, you should notice serendipity, but be careful because serendipity or the illusion of serendipity, it's an illusion of serendipity, can be used to manipulate you because sometimes it's a trap. This particular bookmark was a trap. It was marketing. It was really good advertising, but that advertising laid a trap for a lot of people.
Self-help is so popular right now. And I think it's the same thing that people really desire to be their best selves.
Well,
They have an
this,
idea, they can be much better.
that's right. But this material, the gravitas in this material, awakens you not only to higher parts of yourself, to dimensions of experience that you didn't know were possible, but also an entirely new understanding of what the scriptures mean, the
Mm.
what how the parables have direct impact. When Yeshua says, "Watch, do not sleep," suddenly it is about consciousness shift towards an awareness of the sacred. So it is
Yes.
the real purpose of existence right there, accessible and formerly inaccessible in the religions that surround us, who don't even know the treasures that they carry down through time.
People say they're woke now, that everyone is striving for awakening. In our generation in particular, everyone is striving to wake up, to become conscious. And the way that we understand it, because we don't have any sort of philosophical religious base like that, is to then go into politics. And that's where this woke thing kind of took off from. But it really was just a striving to wake up and to not be so mechanical anymore. And it got a little fuzzy. It didn't really work out so well, but it is the same goal, is to wake up.
Yes, and it is a paradox that is often misunderstood. Often it is either or, either the inner life or the outer social activity, when in fact some of the greatest social reformers in history were saintly people who had
Mm.
truly transformed themselves. So that inner change is about ultimately being a blessing, a gift, a contributor, a compassionate being in the outer world. It is not an internal selfish thing at all. It is liberation from selfishness, is what it is. And
Yes. Yes.
I do want to say that in 1978, when this was happening for me, 77, 78, 79, discovering it, you had to go into used bookstores. You had to hunt. It couldn't be found. You had to really want it badly. Nowadays, at the hit of a keyboard, you get everybody and their mother-in-law's ideas on Gurdjieff. So it is in some ways more difficult to get to it because it is the waters are so muddied about what this is, what it is meant to be.
Yeah, I see a lot of people go online to find spirituality, which is where you would find it. It's there. I mean, you can find any book you need, you can find any teacher you need. So it is there, but then they get caught up in various little traps because they'll be on Reddit or they'll be on Tumblr or they'll be on Twitter, and something will drag them in and they'll get kind of caught into these little sideways paths that take them off of the main one. And they did mean well. It's just, and then there all these ideas fill their head, and then they say, well, this has to be the truth because there's so much foundation that they've built through all of their findings on the internet. And so then they get caught and they need to get out of that. I think you would have been my mother's age. So she actually came out to California in 76, did the whole spiritual thing as well, which is very interesting. She didn't get caught with Gurdjieff. She got caught with something else in San Francisco. Um, but I wasn't alive then, so I don't know if it was much more difficult now than it is then. So I can't say for a fact, but I know there was a lot happening for you as well, for your
Well,
generation as well. There were a lot more
yes,
ideas.
that's right. Well, it was a breakout of what had been, of the materialistic culture of our parents, of the mindset, of the focus, a discovery of the East, a discovery
Mm.
of being rather than doing, meditation, all of that. It was a breakthrough because the Christianity of the West had failed us in putting us face to face with mystery and wonder and the deep things of existence. and reduced it to dogma and politics and other things like that. And in some ways, we had to leave the church in order to find what it contained. That was my case. Many of my generation never came back, of course, because it was such a tiny box, so limited. I read a book once when I did go to seminary later called The Reenchantment of the World,
Mm.
rediscovering that dimension of the sacred, the intuitive, the symbolic, which was missing from our rational world. And to jump forward here in our time, what you have pointed out and what amazes me is that though we are no longer in that era of the 70s with that great music, that great searching, etc., we are in a time when cults are more accessible than ever, as you have made clear.
Yes.
And by the way, I'm fascinated by why you're so fascinated about cults. You'll have to share that sometime. Your study of cults and why it means so much to you. And one reason we're talking is because you have put on the internet, on that ocean, in that ocean, the very best expose next to our friend Jennings Brown
Hmm.
of the fellowship. And that I was quite stunned when I came across it. And it still remains the main thing to discover on YouTube about that cult, which we'll get into in a minute. But the value of it is because it is ever more dangerous now through the new technologies to get caught up in things like that.
Jennings Brown did this great podcast series that completely exposed the Fellowship of Friends. He interviewed people who were still in, people who had gotten out. He went through all of the records, a really thorough job. So I'm going to link that at the bottom down below.
How long were you in the fellowship for?
So uh, I was in for a year before I went to the heart of it in Northern
Mm.
California. And I stayed there. I was one of those vineyard workers building that vineyard for a time.
Oh, it's beautiful. The pictures are beautiful.
Yes,
This is-
but it was pure slave labor, is what it was, of course.
Mm.
But to understand how that could be, how so many intelligent, educated Americans at the time
Mhm.
could give themselves over to such a thing, making $100 a month or something, right? And working 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. It is because with our recognition of what the fourth way made possible for our own inner transformation, the school, as it is called, was giving us insights into all of humanity's, Western European primarily, Greek and such, wisdom. Every morning there'd be a little card with a saying from some wise person. Socrates, Goethe, somebody, Shakespeare, that we would carry with us all day long, that one thought. So we were uplifted by this third force of beauty and wisdom, etc. And it was unthinkable in 1979, 1980, 1981 that there was something nefarious going on. And
Mm.
ironically, I ended up in my third year, I guess it would be, in the Los Angeles Center with Samuel Sanders, whose name you've mentioned, who was the man in '84 who brought the first lawsuit. And at that time, none of us were aware that such atrocity was going on backstage. So I was in from, I would say, 78 to 81. And it was
Okay.
still a pristine time.
That's amazing that you were able in this pristine time where everything is so nice to say that there's something wrong here and to realize that there's something wrong there.
For myself, without knowing anything of what came later, what is now known, I was confronted with the inescapable fact very simply, that there was no goodness here. There was no basic care for each other. Somebody from Finland was a student there who was completely abandoned. We were in San Francisco. Nobody cared what condition he was in, of depression and isolation and fear and tough luck, you know. So we're all working these super efforts, as Gurdjieff calls it, which we understood to be intentional ways of reaching new levels within ourselves by working as we did. But nobody talked about empathy, kindness, consideration. And that became a real serious issue for me. I must say, at the same time, I had not lost sight of the Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross, Thomas Merton, especially at that time, who came into my life and showed parallel ideas, similar ideas, but with love, you know, for humanity. And clearly there was something of that utterly barren, vacant in the fellowship. Now, I
What
must tell
religion
you,
were you raised as?
my father was a Protestant pastor.
Okay.
So we grew up in a Protestant church. However, I grew up in Europe, my childhood in Europe, and so I was exposed to monasteries and cathedrals and sort of a larger perspective of Christianity from the American Protestant view. Later, my journey took me into Orthodoxy, which is a very interesting story because it ended up being the roots of the fourth way in many ways, which is a whole other thing that came and reveals the perversion of the teachings that took place in the fellowship. But to jump ahead, let me say to you that it's only a few years ago, encountering your revelations and Jennings' revelations, that I had to face the fact, 45 years later, that from the beginning, the fellowship, Robert Burton, was a perverted setup. Because Alex Horn and his school was a disastrous distortion, degradation of what the teachings were. And as you have pointed out, Burton just took a blueprint of that monstrosity, violent and twisted, and turned it into his little sophisticated world where he could do anything he wanted.
Real quick, in case you haven't seen the video on the Fellowship of Friends, Alex Horn was Burton's teacher, and he led a very abusive school. And Burton himself was abused in that school, and he went on to abuse other people. It's really unfortunate what happened.
That is tragic. That is really tragic, especially
But
for the people who didn't have this realization.
I knew back in 1979 and 80, I'd heard a person had committed suicide upon leaving the school. Now I understand that that information was released to us so that we could realize how dangerous it was to leave a school. You know, there was a very strong thing of you leave, you're lost. And unfortunately, Gurdjieff himself had contributed to that in the book In Search of the Miraculous. It is, which is sort of the key teaching book on this journey of the teachings. Gurdjieff says, you leave a school, you're without a school, you're like a person out at sea all by themselves. And one of the great discoveries for me was that there's nothing more blasphemous than to tell someone that you cannot find God anywhere, everywhere. Only with us can you do that. That is pure cultish, the supreme red flag. Only we can give you God consciousness. I have to credit Mer Baba, a little book I found in somewhere around 1981 in San Francisco, and he had a list of 10 things to look out for something that would be a cult. And that was when I completely woke up to every aspect of this hierarchy of the school was in fact cultish, every piece of it. And that's what was the hardest thing for all of us, is this sophistication, this high culture, this deep teaching was a package around nothing other than classic cultish power, control, mind control, all of that, you know. We just couldn't believe it. We'd been so fooled by the externals of it that we couldn't imagine. We couldn't, we're not ones to be caught by such a thing. Those people are, right? Waco or something, not us. But
Yeah.
in fact, we were among the worst because, as you know well, Burton is a extreme spiritual criminal of the worst kind.
Yeah, he seems to have even gotten worse after you left. It seems to have gone downhill, downhill, and he's done things that I can't understand. I can't understand, honestly.
When I was there, I was 24, right? I was exactly what he was hunting for. And as if it hasn't been said in this encounter, but he was going after heterosexual young males as his uh, what obsession. And
Mm.
I almost angelically protected, in my view. I went right past it, and that could have been very destructive, as you can imagine, as it has been for literally thousands of people. Um, but for whatever reason, I was kept safe. And part of it, I say, was the purity of my motivation. I was so tuned into what I was looking for and was able to get out. And part of the value of our talk here is for those who get caught up in what looks good, what sounds good, what seems right. Don't pass up those red flags, any of them. Anything that's dehumanizing or that's not in the direction of what your hopes and dreams were, what you felt led to, is somebody else's agenda, some Machiavellian trick. I think of that other cult lady that you've dealt with, that Jennings also dealt with. What's her name? Who's YouTube star
Oh, a mother
lady?
god, mother
No, no,
goddess,
no.
or mother god?
No, it's her ex-husband who got him to the fellowship. Teal Swan, Teal's
Teal
Teal
Swan,
Swan. Yeah, that
yes,
that one. Yeah. Now some of us can
that's
look at her.
messy.
Some of us can look at her and
Go
see
on.
immediately that the energy's wrong, right? It's in her face, in her aura. And yet she can captivate so many because the vulnerable are so accessible now, more than ever. I had to take a one-way ticket to California, sell everything, one-way ticket. Now you can sit in your bedroom and get caught by this stuff. So it is extremely dangerous.
Look, I'm just going to interject here because this is really important. You have got to listen to yourself. You have to listen to your instinct. You have to listen to that little voice in your ear, that little cricket or whatever that's whispering to you. You have to listen. Is this group that you are in, are these people you are around, do they reflect your values? And if they don't, you got to go, because that's the most important thing. You can negotiate smaller things here and there, but these major values for Ted, it was that these people had no consideration for others. They were inconsiderate. They did not value other people. And he's a Christian, so he said, this isn't for me. But when you're in that situation, there is no roadmap. You have to make your own map. And do these people represent your values? Listen to yourself. You're very important. You should listen to yourself.
Are you an Orthodox priest now, or are you part of the religion?
10 years ago, I entered Orthodoxy because I had studied it for the previous 25 years without
Mm.
entering the church. And I did go from being a Protestant pastor. So I actually went from being an esoteric member of a school, which turns out to be a cult, to a Protestant pastor, which is totally counterintuitive. But I was studying the mystics and then the Philokalia, the book of orthodoxy, from fourth century to 13th century elders, spiritual teachers, and bring it into my Protestant environment in my sermons and so forth. So I was always calling upon the full legacy of Christianity. But ultimately, I found that even as I brought in New Agers, seekers into the form of the Protestant church, it became evident to me that the form just doesn't work.
Mm.
There's too much of it that would rather die than change, that is too barren in what's possible. And so for myself, the natural progression had to be to fully immerse myself in orthodoxy. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, I discovered in the early 90s that Gurdjieff came out of orthodoxy and that his very teachings on self-observation, for instance, there's something in the teachings of the early fathers and mothers of the church called the watch of the heart.
Mm.
There is something called Hezekiah, which is inner silence, inner tranquility, sacred silence. And before you know it, all of this esoteric stuff has a Christian base that we didn't even know was ours to discover because it came from the East, the Middle East, from Greece, and since 1054 had been cut off from Western civilization. All we knew was the Catholic Church and then the Protestant sects. And now we're discovering there's this treasury of mystical, transformative teachings out of the early church that are as alive as ever. Granted, they are in a form that is as rigid as ever, because the very nature of the form is to not change with the fashion of the times, with the culture, but to carry through time something. So that means it has its own limitations, as you can imagine, right?
But that's
It's
useful now when everything's changing so quickly. Sometimes you need an anchor, something there to at least know what true north is. At least there's a true north there. Because
you're
right
absolutely
now,
right. That's
the
right.
trends change by the week.
That's correct. You're quite right. And I must say, you see, I'm holding what's called a prayer rope because there is a sense-based spiritual connection. In other words, the knowledge was so profound, the psychotherapy of the ancient times was so profound that through the senses we connected with the spiritual. So that when I walk into an Orthodox sanctuary, just the aroma of Ethiopian frankincense puts me into another state of consciousness. I'm no longer in the 21st
Mm.
century. I'm someplace else. That alone is worth its weight in gold, if you will, As you say, it's a true north, a mystical reality in the midst of this completely secular world.
Actually, right here, we spent a lot of time talking about the fourth way, Gurdjieff, and hobbies. And that's actually going to be another video that's coming out soon. Wait for that. But what's interesting here is that just because Ted Nottingham left the Fellowship of Friends doesn't mean he abandoned Gurdjieff's teachings. In fact, he was able to circle back and get more out of them because he had more experiences once he left. The thing about this is Gurdjieff is dead. He was dead in 1979 when Ted found his way into the cult. So Robert Earl Burton does not have the monopoly on Gurdjieff's teachings. So if you ever get caught in a situation where you're like, I really like these teachings, but this school isn't any good, okay, take the book and bounce. They don't own it. That person is in history. That person is in history right now. And you can take their teachings and you can move on, just like Ted did.
Listen, we've come a long way from the fellowship, it seems.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Well, no, yes, of course. But you've come a long way from the fellowship. That has not dominated your life. You didn't let it take over your life.
Not at all. That is correct. And I would have left it as dust in the wind, even though I will say in one of my books, I say the most important thing that happened in my life, other than joining the school, was leaving the school. But in its moment, it was significant. Now, it was just the beginning of a journey. And it's a very rich journey that I was blessed to find my way on as opposed to be lost in the wilderness again, you know. But many people don't do that. They don't know where to go next, you know. And because Christianity has done such a poor job at presenting its deeper teachings, you know, the external version, the hypocritical version, the medieval version, the literalist fundamentalist version. Now we have the nationalist version, which is real blasphemy, you know, to tie these things
Mm.
together. Not to speak of the what do they call it, the money one, you know. Be a good Christian,
Oh,
make money.
the prosperity
Thank you.
gospel.
That
Yeah.
word, you know, which is obscene beyond words. Okay, uh, and but it's gone totally out of control, and to the point where it defaces it completely. And it's understandable, and it goes back to my generation. Just in waves and droves, we left it all because we had no idea that there was something there in the way it had been presented to us and become part of the culture. But so I was able to go back through it to find the mystics, to find Eastern Orthodoxy at its best, not its external shell, and to go beyond that also. So I want to repeat, just in this time, in part because of the book that came out in 2022 on, you may have heard of it, Stephen, I forget the author's name, Manhattan Cult Story, in which he revealed
Mm.
23 years of his experience in what was left over of the Alex Horn School. They skipped town
Oh.
in 78 from San Francisco because they were exposed, reconstructed themselves in New York, and he got caught up in it. And to my horror, I realized that they were using the same essential playbook as what Burton did, except, you know, he dressed it up in fine garments. And what does that all mean? That there was nothing at the base of it. And for me, that's really coming full circle, is to go back and look at how I entered the belly of the beast, really, and was blessed to come out untouched by it, unfazed by the darkness that I went into because of even the
You really
naivete.
were unfazed.
Yes,
Yeah, you really were unfazed. I noticed that from your book, is that you did not abandon Gurdjieff. You didn't abandon the teachings. You just abandoned the school that was trying to corrupt the teachings.
that's right. And in ways I couldn't even imagine, because we're up there in the Northern California Sierra Nevada foothills listening to the Bozart Trio in a private concert in the middle of nowhere. That's what he was giving us. So, you know, we were completely fooled by this. And by the way, the reason for it, according to the Gurdjieffian method, is that impressions, what you look at, what you take in, okay, beautiful art, music, is food, is energetic absorption of a certain kind of vibration that impacts your being, just like food, you know, gives you life.
Mhm.
And to have that consciousness of how to be present, how to be aware of what you're receiving, allows you to use it all the more. So that
Mm.
a high impression, you know, Mozart, whatever, can lift you into a higher state. The alternative is to watch horror movies and drink toxicity, you know, negativity
Mm.
and violence, and go down in the basement of yourself. So, in the name of this idea of impressions, which is in the workbooks, this man conned us into enabling his, as you've pointed out, his shopping addiction and his new money lifestyle and all of that, you know, which now that we see the emperor has no clothes, but not only that, he did like the portrait of Dorian Gray. You know that story,
Mm.
right? Total
Mhm.
degeneration. So that by the 90s, by the 2000s, which is long past my relationship to any of it, they're going to Eastern Europe and shipping back people for his satisfaction. You know, sex trafficking, basically, as Jennings pointed out. And to have gotten away with that level of criminality for 50 years is jaw-dropping in this day and age. But it shows you how utterly secretive this world was. As I said, I found it because I was searching so intensively for the knowledge that I landed on his genius idea of bookmarks. As someone's pointed out, if you find a bookmark in a particular book, you assume it's about what the book's about, right?
Mm.
You think it's more of that, which it isn't. It's entering into his world.
It's great marketing. It's great
That's
marketing.
right.
And
That's
sometimes
right.
people who know how to market are much more successful than people who actually know the teachings, which is what
Well, there,
happened.
there you go. That's right. Precisely.
Now, do you think that he thinks that he's an enlightened being? That I'm talking about Robert Earl Burton. Do you think that he thinks he's an enlightened being, or do you think that he knows that he is doing this? He's exploiting people.
Uh, I, when I was there, when I was on site where he lived, listening to Beethoven across the vineyards and all of that, I would have said that of course he thinks he's enlightened. Of course he's experiencing presence and higher consciousness. Now, 45 years later, going back to the beginning, before the fellowship, who he was, what he brought with him, I believe it was a con job from day one.
Really?
And there's even some years ago a picture of him, just to illustrate this. He decided to pass on to his poor school that he had come in. It is now said he has been in touch with the Absolute. Okay, he encountered the Absolute face to face, and they show a picture of him down on his knees at the Apollo, what used to be called Renaissance, having this devotional reaction to encountering the Absolute. But there's a handkerchief under his knee to protect his pants from getting messy. Okay. So it is,
Yeah.
that's what it was. That's what it was. And how shocking, how brazen. And I must say this, I wanted to mention this earlier. You suggested it. People have no foundation, no traditions to keep them sane, to give them some kind of sense of direction. We've all been wiped off of old, long term, fundamental, essentially accurate values so that anything goes. And you can end
Yeah.
up in a cult where there isn't the slightest even effort to be merciful people because that's no longer on the menu. There's talk of higher
Yeah,
consciousness,
especially
but
if you
not, yeah.
yeah, if you consider that some people are NPCs, then then mercy goes out the window. That
But
there's humans and then
yes,
there's people who look like humans. This is not, you can't have mercy in this way.
that is correct. And in the fellowship, they actually, what their name of it was, people in the world outside the school, life people. They're life people. So it's the same
Mm.
idea as the what you're using. It's a term that reduces their humanity to less significant. And because of Gurdjieff's paradoxical behavior, where morality was not absolute, depending on cultures and ethics, depending on purpose, then you could manipulate the life people. Imagine if you have more information about someone's psychology, if you can see the type that they are, what buttons to push, what to expect from them, you can completely manipulate them. And that gets awfully close to evil.
Make sure you watch my last video on NPCs. We had a very important discussion about that. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. I have another video coming out next week, so just wait for that.